Hello, welcome to the Mad Batter channel. My name's Chris. If you find this video interesting and or useful, perhaps you'll consider giving it a like and possibly subscribing to the channel, which will be a great help. Many thanks. In part one of this video, we looked at Lightroom radial gradients and intersecting masks and how you could replicate those masking in the form of selections in Photoshop. In part two, I'll be looking at the Lightroom linear gradient and the brush mask and how we could replicate those in Photoshop. So here we are in Lightroom with a blank grey image. So we'll go into masking and first we'll choose the linear gradient. So you can click in any direction, you can move it around like that. Let's switch on the overlay. So you can see up to this line it's 100% applied, and then it gradually goes down to 0 at this line, the feathering. And then we can apply an adjustment, let's say a large increase in the exposure. We'll turn that off. Now, even though we've gone out of masking and gone back in, with this linear gradient, I can still adjust the position, the size, the rotation, and the feathering after the fact, which is far more flexible than selections in Photoshop. Okay, so now let's have a look at brush masks. So we'll first of all turn off this one, create new mask and choose brush mask. So then you get this panel here. You can change the size of the brush, the feather, and then the flow and density, either the rate at which you apply the effect. With size, you can always use the right angle bracket key to make it smaller and the right angle bracket key to make it bigger. Okay, so let's paint on there, turn on the overlay, and now we'll apply an effect again, like a big increase in exposure. Turn off the overlay. Now, unlike with the linear gradient, you can't, after the effect, change the amount of feather. So if you want a different amount of feather, you'll have to do another one or delete the existing brush. So we'll delete that, and then we'll add another brush. Let's reduce the feather right down, and there we are, a much sharper image. Or we could reduce it down to 0 or move it up to 100. So that's the basic brush mask. Now we'll hide mask 2 and go back to mask 1, which is the linear gradient. So we'll turn that on, go back here, and let's say we want to subtract from here. We can use a brush, big feather, and then we could say, I don't know why I would want to do this, but there we go. And now we've removed some of that linear gradient. We could of course also add with a brush mask. This time we'll take the feather down to 0 and do that. So you can see these are all very flexible. The only thing is you can't, after the effect, change the feather of a brush mask. Now we'll go to Photoshop and see if we can replicate that there. So here we are in Photoshop with our blank grey document. Now Photoshop as such doesn't have a linear gradient selection tool nor a brush selection tool. I click up here, you can see you've got the rectangular marquee tool, the elliptical marquee tool, and then here the lasso, which is freehand drawing, and magnetic polygonal lasso tool, which draws in straight lines. And then of course, sorry, get out of that, under select you have color range, focus area, select subject and select sky, but no linear gradient as such. Now of course, as with anything in Photoshop, there are lots of ways of doing the same thing, and in my view the easiest way to create a linear gradient selection in Photoshop is to use the polygonal lasso tool combined with quick mask mode. So with the polygonal lasso tool, let's click outside, and then draw across the image. If you hold the shift key you can strain it. Click and then just quick around the edge, and there's our selection. Now of course, if we want to feather it, we could have feathered it beforehand by making this more than 0, but unless you know exactly what amount of feather you want, it's probably best to do it this way. Then we'll go filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and then choose our level of feather, whatever we want. So we'll go with that. Click OK, Q to get out of quick mask mode. There's our selection. So now if we get an adjustment layer as before, let's say curves, and we'll go darker this time, and there's our linear gradient selection effectively. And the polygonal lasso tool has an additional advantage that it doesn't have to be straight. So for instance, we could do that. There's our selection, quick mask mode, filter, we'll use the same amount as last time, out of quick mask mode, adjustment layer, curves. So there we have a non-straight linear gradient, which is something that you can't easily do in Lightroom. Turning now to brush masking or selecting, as I say, there isn't a brush selection tool. You could use the lasso tool and draw around an area you want like that. You could have feathered it before, go into quick mask mode and choose filter, blur, Gaussian blur, choose your level of feather, and out of quick mask mode, and that's a sort of brush masking, but not very intuitive. By far the best way to do this is to go straight into quick mask mode and use the brush tool. Now remember to select, you need to paint black. Here you can choose your brush size and hardness. Here I've got not much hardness, 20%, and again you can use the left and right angle brackets key to change the size. And then we'll just draw, and there's our selection. Out of quick mask mode, curves or any other adjustment layer, whatever you want to do, and there we go. You can of course change the brush selection easily enough. So we're going to quick mask mode, paint our selection in. Now let's say you want to remove a little bit of it. All you've got to do is to change the brush from black to white, either by pressing this double-headed arrow or just press X on the keyboard. Now we'll make our brush a bit smaller. Let's make it much harder, and let's say we want to do something like that. Out of quick mask mode, curves, adjustment layer, and there we are. So that's a very flexible way of creating a brush selection in Photoshop. And of course it is easy to interact the linear gradient with a brush selection. So let's go and get the polygonal lasso tool. We'll make a selection like that. See there, we won't feather it, but we'll go back into quick mask mode, select the brush tool, and let's say we want to subtract something. We'll have a soft brush, and let's say we want to subtract like that. Okay. And then let's say we want to add, so we need to switch to black, press X on the keyboard, and we'll add to our selection up here like that. So there's an unusual selection. Q for out of quick mask mode. Go into the layers panel, get an adjustment layer, let's say curves, and do that. And there we have. So that's a combination of a linear gradient and an addition and a subtraction of a brush selection. If you want to intersect with your linear gradient selection, that's pretty easy if you want to use one of the selection tools up here to intersect with. So let's draw our linear gradient. No feathers, you'll see. Then make sure you're on the intersect button. We'll choose the rectangle marquee tool. Make sure I say we're on the intersect. Just draw, and there's the intersect selection. Deselect to get out of that. Now if you want it all to be feathered, then we'll go back into here, draw our selection again, quick mask mode, filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Now you'll need, in order for the intersect feather to be the same, you'll need to remember how much you've feathered. So here we've got 10 pixels, click OK. Now we'll get out of quick mask mode, we'll go select our rectangle marquee tool, make sure we're on intersect, and make sure that this is the same figure. So in this case it's 10 pixels, assuming you want it to be the same figure, of course. And then just draw, and then we have the same thing with a 10 pixel feather. Now if you want to intersect your linear gradient selection with a brush selection, that gets rather more complicated, because of course Photoshop does not have a brush selection tool which you could use in conjunction with the intersect button up here. So I'm afraid it gets a bit more complicated. So we'll draw our linear gradient, and now we'll get our brush selection, brush tool, paint with white, and let's say want to do that. Now the intersect we want is just this bit of the brush stroke here. So I'm afraid we need to isolate that before we go any further. So we've got to go back, get the polygonal lasso tool, and then fill this bit with black to select it. Deselect, and now we've got essentially a selection which is the opposite of the intersect we want. So if we go out of quick mask mode and go select inverse, now we have the intersect that we wanted, and can apply our usual curves adjustment to it like that. Of course, should you want your intersect selection to be feathered, then at the point you've isolated the selection, then obviously you can go filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and choose your feather, quick mask mode, and so that's the same thing but feathered. Now this video has been quite long and some of it's probably a bit hard going, so I thought I'd end by showing you an example of how you might use these techniques. Here we have an autumn image, but the bottom left corner is too dark and I want to even up the light. So we'll start by creating our linear gradient selection, polygonal lasso tool, something like that. We're going to quick mass mode, and then we'll obviously want to feather this selection. That looks about right, so we'll click OK. And now we want to add to the selection with the brush. So we take the brush, make sure we're painting in black and 0 hardness. And it's sometimes a good idea not to paint with 100%, but to do it a much lower opacity so you can gradually build up the effect. So we need to add some of this dark bit here, maybe some across there, and then these bushes here, we can go over those to make them slightly stronger selection, maybe a bit across there, if you want to. So that's our selection. Out of quick mass mode, choose the curves adjustment layer. Now we don't want to increase the highlights, but we do want to increase the shadows. Maybe a bit like that. There, so you can see now we've evened out the light and it looks much better. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video and you found it useful. You may need to watch it a couple of times to take it all in, but thanks for watching.